All right. We are live from Occupy City Hall in Rockford, Illinois. My name is Leslie Roth. I am a member of the May 30th Alliance organization. This segment is Rockford reading. We are reading In Defense of Looting by Vicky Osterwile. We are on Chapter 8, Civil Riots, page 189. Here, let's just hop right into this. Okay. Though incredibly important, the winning of national civil rights legislation and legal desegregation through these most visible campaigns in the South was not the apex of the movement's power or achievements. The fall of Jim Crow prepared the terrain for a more radical restructuring of American society. It was, in many ways, only the opening part of the struggle. However, history does not unfold like a book, and we must also push against the idea that the movement simply grew progressively stronger and more radical until it climaxed in the Black Panther Party and various revolutionary tendencies of the late 60s and early 70s. Following the premise that looting represents an incredibly powerful tactic in the revolutionary strike against white supremacy allows us to focus on the string of hundreds of urban riots from 1964 to 1968 as an escalation of the movement's already in progress, an escalation that most acutely demonstrated the extent and breadth of white supremacy and offered the most prolonged and successful attack upon it. Otherwise, the riots and uprisings that explode onto the scene in the Northeast in 1964 seem inexplicable or somehow related only negatively to the Southern movement. If the country was really experiencing a transformation of race relations, why were things still so bad in the North? Whereas de jure segregation may have been a Southern thing, de facto segregation through redlining, public schools, and racist unions and hiring practices was no less prevalent in the North. Protests for housing, employment, and educational justice were widespread in this period. For example, in the years preceding the Watts Rebellion, 250 civil rights protests took place in L.A. And it wasn't just legislative victories that these protests achieved. Rioting won huge concessions in the form of cash and programs, federal funding that flowed into cities and ghettos through the 70s. This cash neither solved the problems the riots fought against nor survived the rightward swing, neoliberal cuts, and restructuring that started in the 80s. But it is still a significant historical fact of the period and one that is often disconnected from the, quote, movement, end quote, proper. And so I think that, again, we're starting Chapter 8 of In Defense of Looting. The common theme throughout this book has been how many different turning points in American history have hinged upon riots taking place, have hinged upon uprisings taking place and civil unrest taking place. And this, we began at the very inception of the American colonies and Vicky wrote about all the different times in the inception of the mayor of America and colonialism. These riots and uprisings took place. Vicky pointed out how they took place when the British colonies had control, or when Britain had control of the colonies, and how these uprisings were something that were used by the people who were living in the colonies to throw off the oppression of Britain and to throw off the exploitation of Britain. Then we went through the book and it spoke about how during slavery, uprisings and riots and looting were things that were used to break down the institution of slavery. It even spoke about how since the black body was considered to be property and not considered to be a thing that was human or a person, that when slaves ran away, that was even a form of looting. That when Harriet Tubman would come with the Underground Railroad and different conductors of the Underground Railroad would come in an attempt to free slaves, that was also a form of looting. And so I think that's another thing that's important to take place. I think it's important to note. Again, one of the things that we want to make sure that we're emphasizing here is having critical conversations about these issues. Too often these conversations are very surface level and they don't give the complexity that the issues deserve. And so as we get into 1964 through 1968, which is what they're alluding to speaking about in this chapter, we get to the more notable and more common uprisings and civil riots that have happened, which happened in urban cities and in inner cities. And again, I believe that the importance of taking notation of the uprisings that took place in the late 60s is that it was an extension of the civil rights movement in the early 60s and in the 50s. It was a generation of people, a generation of black people who had seen so many of their parents and grandparents try to do what was considered the respectable way about trying to get your rights, respectable ways about trying to get your freedom and liberty, and have become fed up with the violence that they've dealt with in those respectable ways, have become fed up with the lack of progression that they dealt with in those respectable ways. And so I agree with the concept that the uprisings in urban areas towards the end of the latter part of the 60s was an extension of the civil rights movement. And again, I don't think that those things can be separated from each other. I think that even when you think about 1968, that after Dr. King, one of the people in the more forefront in the nonviolent demonstrations and nonviolent campaigns that were taking place, which we sort of already alluded to in some other chapters, when he was killed, that there was a mass uprisings. There were protests, uprisings and rebellions that took place all over this country, and that led to legislation being passed. And so I think it's important that we keep in context that there has never been any movement that has taken place in this country that has progressed the society or progressed the humanity of the society that did not come attached with rioting, that did not come attached with looting, that did not come attached with uprisings. And again, politics is war without bloodshed, and war is politics with bloodshed. And I think that is something that we have to keep in its proper context. I'm watching this HBO series called John Adams, and in the HBO series they show how the colonialists that lived in Boston tarred and feathered a British soldier who was trying to import tea from the colonies. They showed how and again, these are white. These are groups of white people, and not only are they groups of white people, but they are. Not only are they groups of white people, but this group of white people are all British born or descendants of British born people. And you see the struggle that they are having in an effort to get their liberties and get their freedoms. And you see how the extent they didn't believe that any extent was too far when it came to trying to get their liberty and to trying to get their freedoms. And they were completely against taxation without representation. And they felt that any means were necessary. And so I think that for me, that was one of the things as I was watching this show. It made me think back to the In Defense of Looting and think back to some of the things that were pointed out in the book In Defense. Oh no, I'm okay. Thank you. In the book In Defense of Looting, and so I think that is something that we have to keep in its proper historical context as we read about these uprisings, as we read about these rebellions. Understand that it was uprisings and rebellions that led towards this country gaining its independence, that led towards slaves being that led towards African descendants being torn out of the bondage of chattel slavery. And so there's never been a moment of progression in this in the society without these uprisings happening in correlation. Like Dr. King said, it is the language of the unheard, and we live in a country and in a nation, in a society which regularly does the best it can to not hear its community members, to not hear. All right, okay, had a connection issue, some connection issues. Fucking weak ass mic, gotta get this mic fixed. And we gotta get this mic fixed. This shit horrible. Just need to buy a new mic. Actually, I don't think it's no fixing this shit. Damn. It's crazy. All right. Okay. All right, let's pick it back up. We're on page 190. 1 second. Damn. Okay. What else shifts the narrative of the Black freedom movement if you focus on the urban riots rather than the more formal movement surrounding them? I do this not because I believe that the major riots of the 1960s are the only or even the most important component of the movement. But in most histories, the riots themselves, which make up a huge and crucial part of the experience of the people who fought for their freedom, tend to be narrative blank spaces. Carefully investigated contemporaneous. Carefully investigated contemporaneous sociological studies and government reports, such as the McCone and Kerner Commission reports, tended to treat riots primarily as, quote, outbursts, end quote, reflex actions responding mechanically to the tragic conditions of the ghetto. Focused on discovering riots' causes in order to prevent future occurrences through federal government action, these studies decontextualize the riots from the broader movement. They instead portray riots as resulting from the existence of pathological communities and criminal depravity and defined by poverty, broken families, and general social collapse. Riots were seen as criminal, and the explosion of riots all over the country was explained as a kind of, quote, infection, end quote, spreading senselessly through imitation and desperation. If, following Christina Sharp, anti-blackness is the weather, then these riots appear as hurricanes or flash floods, a terrible fact of the climate that must be accommodated, against which infrastructure, police, prisons, insurance, national guards, curfews, the escalating, quote, leaders, end quote, must be built, but about which nothing can be done. Even in excellent, vital histories that reject the pull of this anti-black narrative, riots are often treated like signposts, objective markers of racial tensions. They are treated as a natural and naturalized fact rather than as serious and focused bursts of grassroots movement, organization, struggle, and rebellion. But these riots often manifested as crucial moments that molded activists, radicalized masses, and transformed the movement's trajectory. And again, I think that the one of the things that it happens is that just like nonviolence or violence is a word that becomes loaded when you start speaking in the context of protest and demonstrations and movements, so does the word riot and the concept of riot. It becomes loaded when you start speaking about these things, and it becomes something that is used in a divisive manner. But in the keeping of this, I always say that everybody who has played a role since May 30th to now, everybody who has acted in any type of a manner for the liberation of black people, for the ending of police terrorism, for the ending of mass incarceration, the ending of racial injustice, all of those people have been integral into getting us closer to those things happening. Just as much as people who marched were integral, so were the people who spray painted District 1 and tore down the letters that were at District 1 and were involved with throwing rocks at the building at District 1. And again, part of the reason for that is because those actions display the type of emotion that is present in the community. It would be it was more genuine and honest for them to go and express their emotions in that way, based off the things that we experience in this community and we experience from these institutions, than it would have been for those people to go and not do those things. Because we live in a community which since 1990 there are average of 2 or more in custody deaths or police or officer involved shootings, and each time is justified. Because of that, and then the actions that they took were even more justified by the fact that these police officers would then beat people and assault people and pepper spray people and tase people. And then the reaction to that would be people going and looting stores, people going and setting fire to stores. You know, I don't think nothing burned down here, nothing of that nature. But again, those actions happening also help to bring more awareness to May 30th and bring more awareness to the actions of the issue of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. That helped to heighten the awareness about these things, and it helped to open up the door and give the May 30th Alliance and other activists the opportunity to do the work that needs to be done in this struggle. And so again, that is, I agree with that, as I can speak as an activist who began his activism after what some people call riot, or what some people would claim to be nonviolence, or call an uprising. That was what galvanized me to be involved, just as multiple other people who are involved with the May 30th Alliance were galvanized by that. Again, I mean, we're named, our organization is named from an event of an uprising that took place. And it wasn't just an uprising that took place locally. It was something that we seen take place nationally and globally after George Floyd was murdered. And so, here, give me one second. I'm going to grab a hoodie real quick. Okay. So again, I think that we have to keep in context that these, the Boston Tea Party is something that America celebrates. And so the same way that they celebrate and consider the people who took part in the Boston Tea Party heroes, we should celebrate the people who took place in the things that went on in Watts, and the people who took place in the things that went on in L.A. and the same thing with the people here that's in Minneapolis. Those things are to be celebrated with the understanding that those things were all markers that helped to progress the struggle that we are currently in right now. Okay, we're on top of page 191. Appreciate it, man. Appreciate it. Top of page 191. Despite the national and historical focus on the March on Washington, it was the preceding struggle in Birmingham, the, quote, duel of rocks and fire hoses, end quote, that pointed in the major direction the movement was headed. Through 1963 and 1964, as movements proliferated across the South, including the incredibly important grassroots organizing of the Mississippi Freedom Movement, whose 1964 defeat at the Democratic National Convention would convince most SNCC activists that there was no future for them in federal politics or the Democratic Party, urban rebellions also began to pop off, including the early rebellions in Cambridge, Maryland. I'm not surprised if you haven't heard of Gloria Richardson and the Cambridge, Maryland civil rights struggle she led. I hadn't until I researched this book. But considering her fame during the movement, we absolutely should have known about her. Richardson, quote, received nearly daily front page coverage in local and national newspapers in 1963 and 1964, end quote. And yet, quote, Gloria Richardson and the Cambridge movement were not mentioned by the authors of the leading studies of the civil rights movement, end quote. Cambridge is a picturesque seaside town, geographically isolated from the mainland of Maryland. In the 50s and 60s, its black inhabitants were desperately poor. As in so many towns across the country with large black populations, in the wake of the 1960 student sit-in movement, and further influenced by a freedom ride that came to Cambridge in 1961, civil rights organizing began to grow in Cambridge. At the age of 39, Gloria Richardson, the respectable manager of a local pharmacy, was voted leader of the Cambridge Nonviolent Action Committee, a local branch of SNCC, the organization at the center of the Cambridge movement. The Cambridge movement started with sit-ins against business segregation, but its demands always included economic justice as well, in particular, economic justice related to poor housing and hiring opportunities. The movement was incredibly active. At its height from 1962 to 1964, Cambridge activists, quote, regularly sat in at movie theaters, bowling alleys, restaurants, and other public places, marched in the streets of Cambridge, picketed downtown businesses, wrote letters to newspaper editors, and occasionally responded to violent attacks with violence of their own, end quote. But it was the last fact that made Richardson and her movement both famous and a kind of pariah. Richardson and the Cambridge movement openly disavowed nonviolence, choosing to fight back against white racists who attacked their sit-ins, pickets, and marches. On June 12, 1963, protests turned into full-fledged rioting with Molotov cocktails and shootouts between black activists and white racists and police. The National Guard would sit in and would remain in Cambridge for months. Nevertheless, Richardson refused to disavow the riot or her participation in it. And then they have an asterisk here. Let's read what they have down here for the asterisk. Richardson was also controversial for her anti-election stance. In an attempt to buy off the movement, the Cambridge town government put a desegregation bill up for referendum. But Richardson, quote, opposed this measure because she believed that equality had already been guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, end quote. She pointed to the fact that many in her movement were Korean War vets. They had already earned the right to vote by fighting for the United States. Quote, in addition, Richardson pointed out that African Americans in Cambridge had been participating in elections for nearly 100 years and it had not significantly changed the quality of their life, end quote. She argued this directly against the NAACP, Adam Clayton Powell, Robert Kennedy, and MLK. On her advice, the black community boycotted the vote and refused to legitimize the local government. This move kept the movement in the streets and kept it focused on its core principles of economic justice, jobs, homes, and food for all. A year later, when the Voting Rights Act made desegregation the law of the land anyway, she was proven right to not have traded a street movement for such concessions. Okay, let's keep on going here. Nor should she have, because their tactics worked. The Cambridge movement was wildly successful, winning desegregation of transportation, schools, the library, the hospital, and other public accommodations within a year. They demonstrated, even more clearly than Monroe, the continuities between fighting for civil rights and economic justice and between protest and violent insurrection. Cambridge also shows that urban riots were hardly a northern phenomenon. The first two famous ones in the movement, after all, took place in Birmingham and Cambridge. A riot had broken out a year earlier in 1962 in Kinloch, Missouri, a small suburb of St. Louis, after police killed a black teenager with another in North St. Louis in June 1964. A riot in Jacksonville, Florida in the spring of 1964 gained nationwide attention because black students attacked police and vigilantes with rocks. But these uprisings are not always included in the histories of 1960s urban riots, which traditionally begin in the North with the famous Harlem riots of 1964. And then I think it's important to point out here this sentence. A riot had broken out a year earlier in 1962 in Kinloch, Missouri, a small suburb of St. Louis, after police killed a black teenager. And that sounds very familiar with what took place in Ferguson, Missouri, which is also a small suburb of St. Louis, where police killed black teenager Michael Brown. That was something that was more recent historical event. But we see how these issues have continued to perpetuate through our society through all these years. How we can read about something happening in 1962 that elicited the same reaction from the community as something that happened in 2015 or 16 that elicited a certain reaction at the community. And so we've been dealing with this police terrorism for a very long time as a nation, and we have to begin to struggle to end it. We have to begin to struggle to end it everywhere. Okay, that riot began on July 16th. Okay, this is speaking on the Harlem riot of 1964. That riot began on July 16th after police killed a 15-year-old boy, James Powell, shooting him down in the streets. CORE had planned a rally in Harlem that day for 3 civil rights activists whose disappearance in Mississippi was provoking national outrage: James Chaney, Michael Schwooner, and Andrew Goodman. At the last minute, CORE changed the subject of the rally to justice for James Powell and against police brutality. This is a crucial moment of continuity and connection. The struggle against Jim Crow and white violence for civil rights and economic justice in North and South directly transformed through literally the same demonstrations, infrastructure, and organizations into urban rebellions that would bring the United States seemingly to the edge of revolution by 1968. Because that day in July 1964, people didn't just want to rally. They marched and then ran through the streets, fought with police, smashed store windows, and lit fires. Rioting lasted for 2 nights when no charges were brought against the cop, at which point Brooklyn CORE called a rally in Bedford-Stuyvesant, a neighborhood in North Brooklyn. That rally also turned into a riot. For 6 nights total, fighting with police, looting, and arson spread across Harlem and Bed-Stuy. It was something I wanted to touch on here real quick. Give me 1 second. I don't know, Larry. Let's keep going. Inspired by the events in New York and sparked by local outrages, uprising against white supremacist police violence ran rampant across the country. First upstate to Rochester, New York, then across the Hudson to Jersey City. The next riots also took place in New Jersey, first in Paterson, then Elizabeth. A riot popped off in Dixmoor, a Chicago suburb. Next, a major riot erupted in Philadelphia. All of these riots occurred within 6 weeks of each other, July through August 1964. Excuse me. Activists and revolutionaries participated in and pushed forward these uprisings. As we've seen, CORE called the rallies that began the New York riots. Martially trained black Muslims deployed their skills in the streets, playing a particularly important role in Rochester. Malcolm X had just split from the Nation of Islam and, rejecting its policies of separatism and political disengagement, was in the process of building an independent, revolutionary Muslim tendency. His followers were most present in the fighting. Members of the Revolutionary Action Movement, a Marxist black nationalist revolutionary group, agitated, propagandized, and fought as well, particularly in Philadelphia, where they had a large presence as a result of organizing successfully there for 2 years. Though these riots were sparked by instances of police brutality, rioting isn't simply a mechanical reaction to police violence. It's not a knee unbending beneath the doctor's hammer. If it were, riots would occur every day in every city in the United States. Riots, instead, emerge out of movement. Sometimes they come out of that subterranean, invisible, but ongoing movement for freedom, justice, and jubilee that Karl Marx called the, quote, historical party, end quote, that runs through the entire history of capitalism, reappearing seemingly suddenly and spontaneously, though specific histories of uprisings always tell a more complicated story of rising local tensions and grievances. But uprisings occur much more frequently when social movement is highly visible, agitating, and powerful. Riots transform the consciousness of their participants, widen the group of people taking part in political action, and usually produce a new generation of revolutionaries, opening up new directions for further action. And again, I think that's an important thing to note when we think about the fact that we are just not too far removed from these type of uprising taking place in this nation, and we have seen how it has bred revolutionaries, it has bred activists, and we have seen how it has forced the power structure in these institutions to make some type of adjustments. We have not gotten to the place of destroying them and putting new things in their stead, but we have seen the flaws and the faults and the weaknesses in some of these institutions, and we have seen the strengths in our collectivism, the strengths in our movements, the strengths in our struggles, and I think that it becomes incumbent upon specific ones of us to continue to further that and continue to progress that. And so let's continue. All right, we're on the top of page 195, in defense of looting. Charles Fuller, who would eventually go on to win the Pulitzer Prize for drama, was a young writer just starting his career when the Philadelphia uprising occurred. In the important black arts newspaper, The Liberator, he described walking through the town the morning after the riot began. His essay captures beautifully the transformations of consciousness created by these uprisings. Rather than frightening him and making him feel unsafe, the riot flipped the normal racial order and its distribution of safety and violence on its head. Quote, then you slow down and stop in front of the first store whose windows haven't been smashed, and you read the sign, quote, this is a black woman's store, end quote, and somehow you feel good. You tell yourself again, you are safe because you are black, end quote. He experiences, quote, an unbelievable courtesy, end quote, as he walks through the streets, a feeling of solidarity and mutual respect. Quote, maybe it's the tension, maybe it's the power the people feel they possess, but no black man is discourteous to another black man. Somehow, in this sea of black faces, it no longer becomes necessary to fear one another, end quote. This experience of disappearing fear and rising strength and cohesion is described everywhere riots happen across the period and is described today in the wake of anti-police riots. That particular feeling takes months to fade, and most who experience it remember it their whole lives. Many become activists, revolutionaries, or otherwise socially active. Dozens of social, cultural, and political groups and groupings pop up to carry that feeling forward. Within the atmosphere produced by riots, looting then functions to tie that sense of community to a questioning of the historical ties of white supremacy, property, and the law. Quote, you go past a fish fry joint where some drunken broad in her 50s steals a white cooking apron and walks away satisfied. You ask more questions, and you tell yourself unbelievingly that she just wanted a souvenir, and you realize that there is more than that going on inside her, that somehow she has lashed out at every white store owner on the avenue, has gotten back all the hurt she suffered. You quickly dismiss this idea and call her a thief. Reducing looting and rioting to a question of crime, calling the looter, quote, just a thief, end quote, as Fuller ironically suggests, serves to mask the liberatory content of the action taking place. In the midst of the uprising, onlookers and participants alike began to question the ideology supporting property and commodity, order and law. As such, looting represents a fundamental threat to a society, looting represents a fundamental threat to a society ordered by white supremacy, a threat that often goes beyond the boundaries that activists or even self-proclaimed revolutionaries feel comfortable with. These riots all came immediately after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which finally legally declared the end of segregation. The Harlem riots took place only 14 days afterward. As liberals declared victory in an end to racial discrimination, black people north and south called bullshit. But the riots did more than just express a voice. Riots are more than just, quote, the language of the unheard, end quote, as MLK called them. Riots give birth to revolutionary transformation. The three largest riots of the period, Watts, Newark, and Detroit, created three different but powerful revolutionary movements in their wake, each indicating the degree to which riots expand and empower political consciousness and action, and the three together demonstrating how they can do so in unpredictable directions. And so I think it is important to point out that just as and I can't remember the book that I read that was being more purposeful about pointing it out was the book From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. And it pointed out how the movement for Black Lives Matter movement began underneath underneath a black president. The importance of understanding the implications that has. And the same thing is sort of spoken about here, how these riots in the 60s and 64 took place weeks after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. And again, the frustration, and this has been something that we've spoken about in this book as well, the frustration that the black community has felt in taking 2 steps forward only to be met with 4 steps back, or taking 4 steps forward only to be met with 2 steps back, or taking a step to the side and it being painted or illustrated as if there has been a step forward being taken. All of those things continue to build frustrations within the community, and you see those frustrations manifest themselves in events such as uprisings, in events such as riots, in events such as looting, and it becomes our job to make sure we are interpreting those things properly and not allowing any of those actions to become lost in translation, so that way we can communicate to the masses why these things and these events are happening, and how to make sure that these events aren't happening without power being accumulated in the aftermath of the events, which I do believe we have done the job of in Rockford, Illinois, and in Winnebago County of accumulating power after an uprising. It's just about continuing to build upon that. Okay, we're on the bottom of page 196. Again, we are reading In Defense of Looting by Vicky Osterwile. The tension between liberal declarations of victory over racism and the real lived experience of black people in America exploded into full contradiction with the Watts uprising in L.A. The passage of the Voting Rights Act on August 6, 1965, was widely described as a revolution in race relations, an epochal victory of the civil rights movement. 5 days later, on August 11th, Something that looked like an altogether different kind of revolution broke out. That afternoon, 21-year-old Marquette Fry was pulled over by a California Highway Patrol officer not far from his house in South LA. In the passenger seat was his younger brother Ronald, just home from the Air Force. As Marquette was interrogated outside the car, a crowd gathered, mostly watching and cracking jokes. Ronald ran home to get their mom, Rena, who arrived and began berating Marquette for drunk driving. A second cop car arrived. Those officers began to harass and yell at the Frys. One officer bashed Marquette on the head with a baton. Rena jumped forward at him, and an officer slapped her, twisted her arm behind her back, and handcuffed her. Another beat Marquette and arrested him. The crowd jeered as all three were beaten, stuffed in the back of cop cars, and driven away. As news and rumors of the beating spread, people poured into the streets in protest. What followed was 6 days of, quote, insurrection against all authority, end quote, as the local CBS radio station reported it. Quote, if it had gone much further, end quote, the news report said, quote, it would have become a civil war, end quote. More than 950 buildings were damaged and 260 were totally destroyed. Looting and property destruction amounted to over $40 million in damages, nearly $330 million today, adjusted for inflation. But the destruction was hardly wanton or senseless. Almost no homes, schools, libraries, churches, or public buildings were even partially damaged. The use of arson was strategic and controlled. The majority of black-owned businesses were not looted, nor were those businesses that were seen as dealing fairly with the community. Signs went up saying, quote, black-owned, or, quote, soul brother, end quote, and the like, which would usually protect the shop from rioters. On the other hand, businesses that had traditionally exploited people, in particular pawn shops, check cashing stores, On the other hand, businesses that had traditionally exploited people, in particular pawn shops, check cashing stores, and department stores that operated aggressively on credit, went up in flames. Credit records were usually destroyed before anything else took place. Brave rioters even made attacks on police stations. One was set alight. The tactics were simple but effective. As Gerald Horne records in his important history of the Watts Uprising, fire this time. One common tactic saw a group of rioters, usually young men, drive up to a business, hop out, break out the windows, then drive away. Then cars of looters, a much more mixed group, split between men and women, young and old, would arrive and work to empty the store. The store would only be set alight once credit records have been destroyed and goods have been fully looted. Rioters usually remained nearby to make sure the building burned, attacking firemen with bricks and bottles if they tried to put out the flames before the fire had fully consumed the hated business. And I think that, again, that to properly contrast that in American history, you have to think about the actions that the colonies took part in when they were having their separation from Britain. I think that's one of the things you have to put things in the proper context. And the type of exploitation and oppression that was being dealt with by these communities were things that have not been seen by any other communities besides the indigenous people of these lands. And so by the time you get to this 65, when these things are happening, remember all the things that we've read through already in this book in defense of looting, that were all the forms of exploitation and oppression and victimization and dehumanization that black people had dealt with in these communities, and it gets you to understand why these frustrations manifested themselves in this way, and also remember that this is how frustrations have always manifested themselves in this country, in this nation, in this society. And so you cannot ask the products of this society, the products of the environment to be more than their environment is. 1 second. Okay, page 198. How long is this? Oh, we got like 20 pages left in this chapter. We ain't gonna get through this chapter tonight. But we got more. I got some more reading in me though. 1 second. Don't run that light. Okay. Tactics reflected effective communication and mobility among the rebels. Rioters transmitted information over the radio waves, used payphones to spread intel, and listened in to police broadcasts to see where cops would be deployed. False reports were called in to send police scrambling, at which point areas they just, quote, pacified, end quote, could be retaken. In areas they didn't entirely control, rioters focused on hit-and-run strikes, then dispersing quickly to reappear elsewhere. All of these tactics would be adopted and practiced with local modifications in other riots throughout the period. The media described these as guerrilla tactics, and police and reactionaries compared the situation in Watts to the fighting the Viet Cong or the Mau Mau of Kenya. Rioters often appreciated the comparison. Many, encouraged by the thought of Malcolm X, Revolutionary Action Movement, Robert F. Williams, and local militants, understood their actions as guerrilla warfare too. Other rioters tied their actions to anti-colonial struggle via resistance to imperialist war. Many men of draft age interviewed afterwards said something very similar to what one rioter told Sneak newspaper The Movement, quote, "I'd rather die here than in Vietnam," end quote. The predominantly white, middle-class, university-based anti-war movement failed. However, to see the crucial anti-Vietnam dimension of the riots and therefore failed to form unity with rioters, which it might have done by creating defense committees or solidarity demonstrations. The Vietnam War and the movement against it were ramping up across the years of the urban rebellions, and this connection might have helped transform the anti-war movement in a truly revolutionary direction. Rather than listen to or organize with rioters, all but the most radical tended to see Watts only as, quote, a race thing, end quote, failing to understand the links among revolution, anti-racism, and anti-imperialism, links that have been at the forefront of black radical theorizing for decades and that were increasingly spread throughout the black freedom movement at large. Only too late, once the riots had mostly subsided after 1968, did large sections of the anti-war movement recognize these connections. This same fatal reactionary error is being made today by members of the social democratic left who say focusing on race or, quote, identity politics, end quote, is wrong, that we should focus instead on class. They fail to recognize the degree to which black freedom struggles are already about class and race, something they would realize if they simply listened to the people taking part in those struggles. As in Philadelphia, the action in Watts greatly increased feelings of the strength and unity. As in Philadelphia, the actions of Watts greatly increased feelings of strength and unity. As Jimmy Greer recorded in The Movement, quote, "The unity came out in the words, 'Burn, baby, burn.' It expressed itself Friday night on 42nd Street and Avalon Boulevard when a young Negro stood in front of a Negro business shouting, 'Don't bother this one. He's a brother. He's a brother.' It showed when another young Negro politely asked the woman her size, then stepped through a broken window of a dress shop to pick out 10 or 12 dresses. It was seeing people with their heads up and smiles on their faces. Not some dour, grim thing, Watts, like most major riots, took on a carnivalesque, celebratory atmosphere. Participation was widespread. Gerald Horn quotes one report that said 1 in 7 residents of the affected area took part. The Kerner Commission, formed to study the riots of 1967, indicates that 18%, or nearly 1 in 5 residents, participated in those urban uprisings. Not some tiny cabal of troublemakers, rioters were the community. Those numbers mean nearly everyone had an active participant in either their family or among their friends. The cops, for their part, practiced vicious collective punishment on black people. The first thing the police did when looting broke out was to deploy to protect the banks, which they prioritized over pawn shops full of guns and even their own precinct houses. After the second day, the governor declared a curfew, enabling police to carry out mass arrests of anyone on the streets. On top of police, 14,000 National Guardsmen were sent into the curfew zone. 2 days after rioting ended on August 18th, LAPD attacked the Nation of Islam Mosque in Watts, the most visible symbol of black organization in the ghetto, firing hundreds of rounds into the mosque, absolutely riddling it with bullets. It was a miracle they killed no one, although they injured a number of nation members, mostly with flying glass shards. Let's see where we at. And then, okay, that puts us on page 200. We got a few, we got about 10 pages knocked out. Yeah, we got about 10 pages knocked out. So that gets us started on chapter 8, Civil Riots. We'll do some more reading in this, out of this book later on today, later on this afternoon, this morning or so, and try to get through this whole chapter 8 of Civil Riots, which will bring us to the final 2 chapters, which is the inhumanity of looters. Damn, see, doing too much. All right, yeah. So we got about 2 chapters left to go till we finish this. Till we finish this up, we got to do something about this mic. This mic shit is fucking horrible. But all right, I'm gonna move over to Instagram. We're gonna move over to Instagram. Still got a little bit of energy left. We're gonna move over to Instagram. Try to do a live on Instagram. All right, we outside.